I want to just take a few minutes and talk through a problem where we have a graph and they were asked some questions about the function and the limit of the function. And this is a way just to understand and clarify how we view limits when we're looking at a function as a graph, and both one-sided limits and then the overall limit. So I think the easiest thing is just to go ahead and talk through these, and as we try and answer these questions, we can explain the concepts and principles. So for part A, we're looking at this graph here. You can see it's just sort of a random, of course, you notice here, pretty much, in fact, just to make it not distracting, let me cover up the other problems, just so we're not confused at all. You know, when you have an empty circle as part of a graph, that means the graph doesn't exist. So you can see right here when x is 4, it looks like the function should be 5, but there's an empty circle here. So there's like a gap right here. So once again, the up and down axis is the value of the function. And actually, this should probably be 10 here. So let's look at these questions. This is like 4 questions. First, it's saying f of 4 equals what? So this is saying what is the value of the function when x equals 4? So here's x equals 4. So we go up to the function, and of course that's where the function's not defined. There's the graph, there's no graph there. It's an empty circle. So actually, there is no function when x is 4. Now we're asking 3 questions about limits. So the limit as x approaches 4 from the positive side. So the idea is sort of start the far right side of your graph and we're moving, we're going to approach 4 from the positive side. So I'm out here and my value of x is decreasing, and eventually I'm going to keep decreasing the value of x until I get to 4. So hopefully you can see right here. So you ask yourself, the limit means what's the value that the function is approaching as x is approaching 4. Hopefully you can see by this graph that the function is heading toward a value of 5 as the value of x gets closer and closer to 4 coming from the positive side. So the limit as x approaches 4 from the positive side is going to be 5. I'm going to look at the limit as x approaches 4 from the negative side. So I start here on the right side of my graph. And once again, x is approaching 4. I'm coming from the left side of the graph, so I'm tracking the graph or the function. And I'm asking myself, as I get closer and closer, as x gets closer and closer to 4, what is my function or graph approaching? And once again, hopefully it's obvious that the function is approaching 5. Now the last question is, what's the limit of f of x as x approaches 4? Now it's interesting. So here's the limit. This is a one-sided limit coming from the positive side. One-sided limit come from the negative side. And here's the overall limit. It's actually pretty easy to look at because what happens is the rule is to see what your limit is, you look what the limit is coming from the high side, and you look what the limit is coming from the low side. And if they're approaching the same value, then that's your actual limit. So I come from the high side, the function's approaching 5. I come from the low side, it's approaching 5. Therefore, the limit as x approaches 4 is actually 5. And that's one of the ways we try and determine the limit, especially when we are using a graph to compare the positive and negative one-sided limits. If they approach the same value of the function, then you actually have a limit. So let's go to the next problem. Hopefully you can see, looks like pretty much the same graph, except the difference is I actually have at the value of 4, where there's a gap in my graph, actually the function, I'm going to say the function is defined up here. So actually the same 4 questions. So here, what's f of 4? Well, when x is 4, what's the value of my function? I look here, the function doesn't exist down here, but actually the function does exist. You have to jump way up here. So really, the only difference between these two graphs is here, the function is open or undefined when x is 4 here. It's not on this curve, but there is actually, the function is defined when x is 4, and it's up here at 10. And therefore, just like the previous problem, now when I look at the limit, the one-sided limit coming from the positive side, as I approach x equals 4, what is my function approaching? 5. If I come at it from the low side, as x approaches 4 from the low side, what's my function approaching? 5. So what's the limit as x approaches 4 of the function? Well, the limit as x approaches 4 from the high side, the limit as x approaches 4 from the low side, they're equaling the same value. Therefore, that's the limit. And this makes sense, obviously, because what is a limit? The limit is what is the function as you approach a certain value of x. It doesn't mean, the limit doesn't mean what is the value of the function at that value of x. It's as you get near and as you're approaching. All right, we have another one. Once again, if you look at the difference, this one looks similar, except now there's no gap here. So it's just pretty much the graph. And actually, we're asking the same 4 questions. What's the function when x is 4? Well, here's x equals 4. You go up and it's 5. As x approaches 4 from the high side, what's the function? Well, as I come from the high side and come down and get close to x equals 4, my function is 5. If I come from the low side, as x increases and as x approaches 4 from the low side, the function is 5. So therefore, since the high side and the low side limits approach the same value, you can see obviously that the limit as x approaches 4 is going to be 5. And then there's one more, last one. And this one, the graph changes. It's pretty different. You can see here, we got the graph and it comes up, and when x equals 4, it's empty down here. But it's almost like the graph jumps up and it's filled in at the top and then comes like this. So now let's answer these questions. What is f of 4? So when x is 4, what's the value of the function? Well, right here, there's no function there because it's empty, but there is up here. So it's actually 10. Now, as x approaches 4 from the high side, what's the value of the function? So I come from the high side, and as my x is decreasing, as I'm moving toward x equals 4, what is my function moving close to? 10. Now, as x approaches 4 from the low side, as I'm getting closer and closer to x equals 4, what is the function approaching? 5. Now, one of the basic rules of limits is for you to have a limit at a certain value of x, the low side limit and the high side limit have to approach the same value of the function. Well, the high side limit is approaching 10. The low side limit is approaching 5. They're not approaching the same value, so that means there actually is no overall limit. All right, so that's an interesting little problem here, just to give you an idea of looking at the value of the function and then looking at high side and low side limits and then determining the overall limit. All right, so hopefully you understood this and understand this concept, because this is the kind of stuff that's important to know.